Welcome. I'm Dr. Ken Piper, and I hope you're enjoying my Wonder of Our Bodies video series. We're investigating some of the miracles of anatomy and physiology and function and connection and interaction, one system at a time. This video right now is part two of a topic near and dear to my heart, which is the blood goes round and round, cardiovascular system. In part one, we focused on the heart, the main left heart pump, and followed the 4,000 gallons of blood that pump moves every day around through the big aortic blood vessels down to the arteries that are bringing nutrients and proteins and minerals and oxygen to our brain and arms and legs, every single part of our body and every single cell. So in part two, we're going to focus on what happens when that blood gets to the small arteries and talk about capillaries and veins, and also an important part of our circulatory system called lymphatics. So let's start with leg arteries, and I'm picking up where we left off from part one, and on the left-hand side you can see a little example. The aorta is that large, short red area. That's a broomstick-sized vessel coming down from the heart, and it's made its major divisions into each leg. So on the left side, you can see the main iliac artery dividing into femoral arteries, and at the knee divides into popliteal arteries. We have names for every one of these arteries as they descend in the leg. And on the right, just for information and interest, that's a picture of the back of the pelvis and leg, and that yellow is the big sciatic nerve that runs all the way down to the foot. And the arteries and veins tend to group together in bundles because both the arteries and veins have to travel around joints and behind bones and in between muscles, so it makes, I think, good sense that they would be kind of linked together in their travels. A dye test, you can see the aorta, the single blood vessel on the top, that's up in the abdomen, and this is a beautiful shot of dye coming down the entire arterial system of both legs. If you had a major blockage, let's say right in the middle of that artery coming down, this is what it would look like. So on the right-hand side, this patient has totally occluded the main femoral artery delivering oxygen and blood, and this person is in trouble. If we're not able to open up that artery with various techniques that we have, including clot-dissolving drugs and special catheters and special balloons and even rotor-rooter type catheters. If we can't open up that artery, this leg could be in trouble, and in the worst situations, a gangrene type process would begin down low in the foot and work its way up. Arteries get smaller and smaller as we go along, and I guess the best example I can give you is the tiny little blood vessels on the surface of the eye. Here's a tiny little blood vessel that's been damaged, and this little bleeding is now in between the clear, colorless membrane over the eye called the conjunctiva and the covering over the eyeball itself, which is called the sclera. This scares people when it happens, but it is quite harmless. And you can imagine it can occur most of the time from a little rubbing, dry eyes, situations where you'd put a little pressure in that area. A little more likely to occur if you have a program of blood thinners in your system, but nonetheless scary for people. Capillaries are the tiniest of blood vessels. The arteries have a thicker protective layer that gets thinner and thinner as they go along, but capillaries are just very 1 or 2 cells thick. So they're very, very small pipes, and they look like this. On the red side of the arteries, these are tiny, tiny ones, like I showed you in your eye picture, and they come down into a meshwork of little tiny branches that can be squeezed on, opened, or closed, and they flow into the blue capillaries, and blue capillaries come together in bigger and bigger groups and become veins. So capillaries can open. At the top is an entire capillary bed that's open, and on the bottom you can see a capillary bed that's closed. For instance, when we blush and our face turns red, all of the capillary beds in our face have opened up, and you can see the nice red oxygenated blood. And when we go outside and throw snowballs and come in and the tips of our fingers are kind of bluish, that's when all the little capillaries have closed off their areas. So capillaries are critical as they move back and forth, and in the capillary bed is where all the action happens. So in the capillary bed is where the body exchanges oxygen for carbon dioxide. This is where the capillaries exchange waste material for fresh nutrient material. This is an exchange of fluid. So there's dynamics going on in those capillaries. And the cells depend on good capillary flow. And the whole purpose of the pump in arteries is to deliver blood smoothly through the capillaries. The whole purpose of the vein system is to carry that away so we can recycle it. Capillaries were not discovered until microscopes came along, and the microscopes began to see these tiny things, and then with continued thought and understanding, this whole capillary system came alive. There's many miles of capillaries in our body, and there are areas where the capillaries are really specially designed, kidneys and lung in particular. And the previous picture showed you a kidney capillary bed. The little capillaries are wrapped up in kind of a ball of yarn type pattern where the blood is filtered, and then there's a system to carry that filtered water down as urine. This is a terrible slide, and I don't want you to dwell on it, but on the left you see arteries of different sizes getting smaller and smaller, and then on the right you see veins of getting bigger and bigger. This slide is illuminating kind of a dynamic in medicine which is increasingly important. In the purple box are the names of conditions that attack and damage large arteries. The green are conditions that are damaging medium and smaller arteries. And in the center, in that yellow, are all the conditions that can damage the tiny capillary artery venous system. And that's where the biggest trouble occurs, because that means all the most important little blood vessels in our body are under some stress. This is where hypertension does its damage. This is where many infections cause trouble. This is where many autoimmune conditions show up with difficulty. In the little peach-colored box is the problems that occur in the veins, and they're probably, much as you can see, far fewer things that can happen in the veins. The vein system parallels the artery system. Vein structure is different, though. Artery pressure, 120, 130, 110, pumping pressure. Pressure in the veins, as the blood comes back up, 25 or 30 millimeters. So vein pressure is much lower. The walls do not have to be thick and reinforced. Vein walls are more flexible. They can collapse. They're thinner. The veins tend to be larger. And this is an example of a very simple diagram of the vein system. And the blue veins keep flowing together in bigger and bigger sections. You will probably remember that this looks very much like the diagram I showed you of the artery system. And if we put those together, you can see on the left the red arteries pumping from the heart. On the blue are the veins coming back. And notice the similarity. arteries and veins are going to and coming from the same place. They often travel together in the same, we call, neurovascular bundle. They are critically important, and there is a problem because the veins have to move blood uphill when we're standing, walking, running, jumping. And there's no pump down there in the feet to pump it up, like the heart muscle in the chest to pump the blood down. But we do have a pump in our legs, and it is the muscles. So the veins run in between big bundles of muscles, and every time we squeeze big muscles, we are pumping the blood up. And the veins have little one-way valves. You can see them going up this section of vein, and the muscle squeezes, pushes the blood up. The blood tries to go back down, but the little valve closes. So as long as the valves are working nicely, and as long as the muscles are squeezing nicely, things will go well. Sitting a lot, getting out of shape, not using your legs, not on your feet, not walking is going to lead to increasing problems with vein flow, and those valves can become stretched, and if they stretch and dilate, then we get varicose veins coming to the surface. So valves that aren't working increase the vein pressure that comes outward into veins that begin to dilate, and pretty soon you have a situation looking like this on the right-hand picture. This is a photograph. On the left is someone with varicose veins from chronic venous insufficiency. On the right is the same patient after procedures to close off those dilated outer veins. And those dilated veins are a source of trouble because that's where the blood can stagnate, that's where the blood can form clots, and those big clots called thrombus can break loose and they can come flying right up into the heart and go shooting out to the lungs, and you've heard that term called pulmonary embolism. Sit in an airplane for 8 hours going to Europe with your knee bent, you can reduce the vein circulation in your legs and a blood clot can occur, and it has in a certain percentage of travelers. Long car rides, sitting in chairs for a long time, sitting with your legs markedly bent, like kneeling, all of these factors can affect the venous flow and increase your risk for clotting. Certain drugs increase the risk for clotting. Other medical conditions increase the risk for clotting. The biggest vein in the system is called the vena cava. It's the equivalent of the aorta. So on this diagram you can see the red aorta coming down from the chest. This is in the abdominal cavity. You see where the red aorta divides into the legs. Well, look at the blue big vein coming up from the legs, and it joins together in a nice big structure, the blue one, which is called the vena cava. And if someone has repeated problems or a nasty looking blood clot in the leg, we think pieces are breaking loose, this little basket can be placed in the vena cava with a catheter. The first one was called a Greenfield filter. And you can imagine if we put that little basket in the vena cava, notice on the left the little hooks. So we slide it up there, we open it up, it hooks in, and it can capture these big chunks of thrombus that would otherwise go up into the heart and lungs and could be fatal. And in this case, we capture them until the body can dissolve them. Now, the lymph system I mentioned as being important. I showed you in the capillary system that water's moving back and forth, waste material, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Well, a lot of that water that moves out of the capillaries goes around the cells and may not come back into the capillary system on the venous side. So all that little fluid in between the cells is moved up to smaller little tiny channels called lymphatics. And lymphatics are tiny little channels underneath the skin. They're not super deep. They're not like the veins down in the muscles. They're under the skin, some of them under smaller muscles, but they have a really impressive and needed role in moving that fluid back up and they will pull fluid from the upper body, neck, face, even the brain, pull fluid up from the legs and deliver it into a channel that goes up into the main vein and move that fluid back into the circulatory status. There's all kinds of problems that can affect these lymphatics, everything from surgical issues to radiation to damage. Every time we get infection, our immune system fires up and lymph nodes will enlarge in regional areas to fight the infection. Well, when we do, let's say, breast surgery and we take out the lymph nodes in the left arm, now those lymph channels can drain, but they can't drain well. So if infection gets into those lymph channels or irritation, you can get tremendous vein inflammation. The arm swells painfully and large, and the fluid has no place to go. So lots of issues with lymphatics. They're a miracle part of our system, both immune defense as well as fluid movement. And now we've taken the blood round and round. We've gone from the main pump down the arteries, crossed through tiny arteries, capillaries into the veins, brought it back up the vena cava. Now we're back in the right receiving chamber, an important place because in the right receiving chamber is our natural pacemaker. So that green diagram is the natural internal electrical system of our heart, and you can see how the electrical message goes from the upper receiving chamber. You see the little title called sinoatrial SA node. That sends a message into the upper chambers, past another relay station called the AV node, and then it shoots it down into the main pump. So this is a beautifully synchronized electrical messaging system where the upper chambers fire into the lower chambers in a beautiful dance, synchronous way to move the blood, receiving to pumping up to the lungs, receiving to pumping out to the body. The outflow valves I showed you have those three little leaflets. This is what the inflow valve looks like. And this is a fascinating valve. Inflow valves, one's called the mitral, one's called the tricuspid. This happens to be the tricuspid, but they both look the same. And there are two flaps of connecting tissue. And when the blood comes rushing in, those flaps open up. Then when the heart squeezes, those flaps slam shut, but they don't slam shut too much, and you can see why. Little parachute cords holding on to the leaflets, and the little parachute cords are attached to little muscles. So 90,000 times a day, these leaflets open, the blood comes in, the chamber contracts, squeezes, the blood gets pushed out, and the valve has to slam shut. The mitral valve can take a beating over time and start to leak, either because those muscles get damaged or the little parachute cords begin to stretch or the valve begins to bulge. Mitral prolapse is a condition where we have minor amounts of mitral stretching. And mitral insufficiency is a name for when this valve is just not able to do its job. And a not uncommon approach then is surgical, either tightening of the valve or replacing it. The right heart pump, as I showed you initially in part one, is not so thick. There's again a picture of the left pump, thick wall, 1 centimeter or more, heavy muscle, all spiraling together for squeezing action. The right ventricle is much thinner. Blood does go round and round, as I showed you. It comes in the receiving chamber on the right, gets pumped up to the lungs. The lungs have special capillaries. I mentioned the kidneys have capillaries where the tiny artery comes into like a ball of yarn to do the filtration. And in the lung capillaries, the little arteries come in red, and they network around the little air sacs in the lung. So you can see the air coming in that white tube. It goes out to the small sacs called alveoli. The red little tiny blood vessels release their oxygen. The blue ones are coming in with the carbon dioxide, and you end up with this we call gas exchange In goes the good air, arteries make a difference. So this is a phenomenal type response, and there's about, I think, 2 million of these little air sacs on each side of our body. Blue bringing carbon dioxide, red carrying off good oxygenated blood. This is just another picture to kind of give you a three-dimensional. And that brings us around to the left receiving chamber. We've talked about blood traveling through the heart. I won't go through that in any more detail, but you can see the flow from receiving chamber to pump to lungs, receiving chamber back to pump. Another view of this fascinating valve I told you about, the tricuspid and mitral. Here's how it opens when the blood comes in. Here's what happens when the heart squeezes and it closes. And this is a miracle picture, I think, of just the wonder of it, is to look inside the heart, looking up at that valve. Again, 96,000 times a day, this valve opens and closes. So we're back at the left heart pump. That takes us full around. Blood does go round and round. We've taken you through the whole system. The dynamics of this are amazing. The complexity is amazing. There are ways we can take care of this cardiovascular system. I think clearly one of the points is that the more effectively we flush this system, the better. And that has to do with activity, time on our feet, stimulation of the cardiovascular system. And it doesn't have to be with 45 minutes of running. It can be with 10 to 15-minute intervals of increased activity several times a day. We'd like to have optimal blood pressure. I think that's obvious. Normal blood pressure protects every one of the millions of tiny arteries and veins that are so critical for our life. Taking care of our lungs and getting good clean air into those little sacs will maintain our oxygen levels in the best way. We want to reduce inflammation that's on those little arteries, and inflammatory artery disease is the main cause of coronary artery blockage. And I think it's important to just look at the critical coronary and critical brain arteries and recognize that blockages in those systems are much more, as we say, life or death. This is where we want to act fast. This is where we look at heart attack and brain attack and put them in the same category. Move quickly, open the blockage. So this completes part 2 of a 2-part series on The Blood Goes Round and Round. Please leave comments if you'd like, suggestions if you have them. The website has additional videos, and again, look under my blog posts for the chapters called Learning, and you'll see some of the take-home points for this and other talks. Thanks much.